Okay, this is the end. Our last lecture for this semester, in which I will go over the entire course very briefly. Let's just start. Let's just start with the exam format in the first place. Most people were there on Friday. I think we're only missing a few students, but in case you missed it, the exam's worth 50 points. It's 40 multiple choice and 2 longer answer that you get 5 points for having a complete and accurate answer for. It's at 12 p.m. Okay. Normally we have lecture on Friday at 11. The exam's at 12. Okay. So if you come an hour early, I mean, that's not a big deal, but the exam's from 12 until 1. Okay. So that's when you have to be there. You should, in Canada, we usually say, no matter how badly you do on an exam, you're supposed to stay in the exam for 30 minutes. I think it's actually longer than that before you're allowed to leave, just because it disturbs all the other students when you try and leave. So you should sit and be quiet and focus on your exam. After 30 minutes, stand up, bring the exam to the front of the room. There's gonna be a scan sheet, so you gotta make sure you put in your information correctly. Make sure you bring your ID card. Okay, that's important. I have to verify that you are who you say you are, so make sure you bring your ID card, student card, or you can show me on your phone. But of course, phones, you can't use your phone during the exam, and this is not an open book exam, so you can't use your textbook either. Okay, so let's see if we can get through this. Sometimes it takes a while to get through all the things, but obviously I can't explain in detail very many things. I'm just gonna broadly let you know what things are most important in the course. Doesn't mean there isn't anything that I talk about today. There's gonna be things that I miss that are on the exam, but basically if you know all of these things, you should get a good grade. So you do have to remember some things from the class from before the midterm. It's not as important. It'll be worth about 20% or 25% of the exam. The majority of the material is from after the midterm. So of course, the things that you should remember are the major things, right? We talked about ancient ancient Britain, what the British Isles were like, just the geography. And then we talked about the different people that lived there, the Celtic people, the Britons, and then the Romans and the Germanic, Anglo-Saxon people, and the Vikings, and then the Normans. So you need to know that stuff. Once we got through that, and William the Conqueror took over England and unified Normandy and England, then we talked about the important things there: Magna Carta, the Great Chain of Being, the famine, the Black Death, the Peasant Revolt, Chaucer, Wycliffe, Richard the Lionheart, Henry II, Thomas Beckett. Those are all the people that you need to know and remember, and those are the major events. The 16th century we talked about in quite a lot of detail. So of course there's Henry VIII, and then his 3 Tudor children, Edward, Bloody Mary, and Elizabeth. You need to know who they are. Major thing, the Reformation, right? The split of the church from England being Catholic, and then the Protestant Revolution. Martin Luther, you don't need to know about him, but you need to know the ideas of Protestantism. It's in the textbook. You need to know the difference between Protestant and Catholic, and you need to remember that Anglican is what I said in lecture was Anglicanism thinks Protestant and looks Catholic. So they still have bishops, they still have a hierarchy, there's no pope, but they do the ceremonies, and they still like to do some of the things, like the cathedrals still exist and everything, but The Puritans come along and they want everything to be different. They want everything to be much different, purely Protestant, and to reject everything that's in the Catholic Church. They're the killjoys, and eventually they get control of the country, which we talked about in the 17th century. So after Queen Elizabeth dies, you got to remember Spanish Armada, Shakespeare, Francis Drake, piracy, money problems. There's the 5 major issues, right? Sovereignty, foreign policy, those 5. Those, make sure you know them. And there's King James, and he's Scottish, and he's not really an excellent king. He has some problems with Parliament and running the country, but not really that bad compared to his son, Charles I, who makes a big mess of things and ends up starting a civil war, which Oliver Cromwell and the Puritans, the parliamentarians, win. And they end up killing Charles, and there's about 10 years of no king in England. There's an experiment with republic. But after 10 years, Oliver Cromwell dies, and then there's a restoration. Charles II comes back. All this, we briefly talked about this. All that ends with Charles II dying, James II being Catholic, and William III coming from the Netherlands in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which is easy to remember because it's exactly 100 years after the Spanish Armada is defeated. So 1588, 1688. Also, the day that William invades is also November 5th. And November 5th is the anniversary of the gunpowder plot, when Guy Fawkes is caught trying to blow up King James, right? So not only is it 100 years exactly, but it's also it's the anniversary of the gunpowder plot where some of the members of Parliament found Guy Fawkes before he could kill James and all of the officials, all of the politicians of the country. So it just looks like everything's going their direction, which they call the Protestant wind, right? Remember? Protestant wind. In addition, during the Armada, there was a wind that blew the Spanish Armada up into the North Sea, and then they ended up, being destroyed by a storm. And when William invades England, James, his fleet gets stuck up the channel instead, down the channel, and the wind blows William into England and prevents James from stopping his fleet from landing. And once William lands, he's got a much more experienced army that's actually been fighting against the French for years. So once he lands, James is pretty much in big trouble. His army is not well trained and not very loyal to him. So they basically either join William or they run away. So this idea that it's destiny for the Protestants to defeat the Catholics and for England to become more and more powerful. It's a very important idea, and it continues into America. Okay, so that's basically up to the midterm. Now we got to talk about the American stuff. Right, so there's kind of 2 things you got to think about in this entire course. One of them is the events, like when things happen. Well, I should say 3 things. You have to remember these people. There's these important people. They do certain things, and they have certain personalities, and they have certain positions, and you got to remember that. That's not easy sometimes, but I think it's people. When you have George Washington and Henry II and William the Conqueror and Queen Boudica and Alfred the Great, I just skipped over them by accident, but you do need to remember those people as well. Canute, those people I mentioned, King Arthur, he's not a real person, but you need to remember certain things about them because they become very important, right? They influence other people and they influence the culture as a whole, especially if they're really important people like Arthur or George Washington. So the characteristics they have, you need to know. Thomas Beckett is a very, very important person because he was basically a poor boy, and he grew up and he was chosen by Henry II to be the Archbishop of Canterbury because they were friends, and Henry II thought he would be able to influence him and that he would just, make the church go along with royal policy. However, when Beckett became Archbishop, he took his job seriously and he changed his personality. He wanted to have church policy independent of royal policy, which made Henry II, as I told you, who liked to chew carpets and used to get really, really angry and freak out all the time, it drove him insane. And that's it. And those personality types are important because ultimately he said, will nobody rid me of this turbulent priest? And 4 of his men decided that's what the king wanted them to do. So off they went to kidnap or threaten Thomas Beckett. And when they found him in the cathedral praying, he refused to leave. They panicked and they cut his head off, or sliced his head in half. I shouldn't say he cut his head off. They actually split his head open right at the most holy place in England. That's the worst place to kill somebody. You're definitely going to hell. Those personalities influence. George Washington's personality had a huge influence on the future of America, just because he refused to give up, and he was very strict and charismatic, and he had a certain point of view, as we will discuss in a minute, about foreign policy, which influenced America for over 100 years, because that's what his stance was, and he was so important that everybody tried to imitate him. Likewise, Arthur had certain, obviously he wasn't a real person, or the myth is not the same as if there was a person. The attributes that we assign to Arthur are not the ones of a real person. He's a mythological person. Just like Robin Hood. Even if there was a Robin of Locksley, it doesn't matter because we have a story about Robin Hood which is not true. Those things never happened. But the attributes of Robin Hood, his fearlessness and his rebelliousness, and his love of the poor, robbing the rich and giving to the poor and shooting, double bullseyes and stuff like that. These are the things that people know. And these are they affect all kinds of real people's behavior. As I said, Richard the Lionheart had a sword that he named Excalibur after the mythological sword that was given by the Lady of the Lake to Merlin, and the wizard, put it in the stone, which King Arthur pulled out of the stone, marking him as the King of England, the King of, it wasn't England yet, but the King of Britain. So all of these events end up when Richard the Lionheart takes a sword named Excalibur and he goes to the Middle East, and he goes on a crusade, and he's fighting against Muslim armies. As a Christian warrior, he represents some of the values of King Arthur being expressed in real life. All right, so this manifest destiny thing, this is a continuation of the Protestant wind. And the Americans do believe that they carry the torch, just like the English believed, right up until the sort of transition of global superpower status from the British Empire to the United States. They believed that they had a Christian destiny, which is it's a fact. Manifest means it's just there, right? You don't have to cultivate it or grow it or anything. It's just there. It just exists. So that's a subtle difference between the Protestant wind, because the Protestant wind is basically God showing that he's in favor of the Protestant Englishman, that God is himself perhaps on the side of a Protestant Englishman. But manifest destiny really means that America comes into existence because it is providence is already determined. It's already predetermined that America will become the greatest country in the world. This is just a belief that they have. I'm not saying it's true, just saying it's a belief. So these are some of the fundamental ideas, right? We talked about throughout the second half of the course. First of all, I said American ideals. Freedom is the first ideal. Freedom in many different ways, right? It's partly liberty, it's partly personal, it's partly system, and it's a right. These are also, freedom is a right, and sometimes the contradictions enter in to the American ideals, because how are you supposed to be free if everybody has the freedom? For example, recently, just to connect this to contemporary things, there's been a series of deadly shootings of people with semi-automatic weapons shooting people. The most recent one in Texas was in an elementary school, which is just a horrible tragedy, and it just makes you sick thinking about it. But one of the reasons that this happens is because they're so committed to freedom that they would allow anybody to have a gun, and ultimately that sort of backfires, pun not intended, but when everybody has guns, you actually feel less free. I think nobody in Korea, since we have a sort of gun-free society, and if you have a gun, you need to register it and you have to store it with the police. There's all these procedures, and that doesn't sound like freedom. It doesn't, because you can have a gun or not. It should be your own choice. But it's a deadly weapon which needs to be controlled, and if you don't control it, ultimately there's less freedom, because people are concerned. In order to be as free as the next person, you almost have to have a gun. So it encourages more gun ownership, not less, because the people who want to protect themselves from the other people with guns, they almost feel like they better carry a weapon around just in case, right? Some of the suggestions are pretty ridiculous, like why don't we give all the teachers guns so that they can defend themselves against crazy people who come in the school? You think that? I don't think that's a very good idea. Anyway, this is the, like, if you take ideals to extremes and you apply them in social or political system, legal system too, you end up with some issues, right? You end up perhaps having less freedom. And that's also part, as I said, some of the colonists, they came over, the Puritans, for example, they wanted the freedom to be less free because they wanted to cancel Christmas, and they wanted to have, only nobody work on Sunday and everybody go to church, and no drinking or dancing or parties and stuff like that. And they wanted to enforce that. They wanted a society in which those are the rules, and they wanted the freedom to do that. But in England, they couldn't really do that because you can't really control people's behavior when everybody else is having a festival except you. So that was difficult for them to do until they came to America and they could really create their own space. Okay, so yes, we didn't talk specifically about this, but why is America attractive? Why do people go there? I didn't emphasize this aspect, the American dream, but that's what I was talking about when I said who is going to America. Who was when we talked about the colonists and the interest in America is that there was land available. It was a land of opportunity. There was people went originally to find gold. They didn't find it, but then they started growing tobacco, and then they started growing sugar and cotton and other things. And if you went to America, you had a chance, even if you were a lower class individual or you were poor or uneducated. You could work hard, and you had a better chance of improving your situation than you did in the overpopulated more rigid society of England. So that's why we say it was the land of opportunity and there's an American dream. It still exists, but other parts of the world have their own attractive attributes, which sort of puts the American dream into a different perspective than it used to. So yes, the American ideals: freedom, popular government, the right to rule themselves, the experiment, right? America itself is a great experiment as a whole, but also individuals innovating new technology, invention, trying new systems that haven't really been tried in other places of the world. America was the great experiment. Can we make a democracy? It's the first modern democracy of any scale. It's still, it's still the largest democracy in the world, right? Because we have, to be fair, India's republic as well, and they have a president. China's communist, and those are the only two countries that are population-wise or comparable in size, in terms of land to the United States. So it's the largest and newest, not the newest, it's the largest and oldest modern democracy. Is what I meant to say. At the time, it was the newest when it was created. So that's a great experiment. And of course, they believe in their special status, which is sort of tied into manifest destiny. And I said, there's a positive side and a negative side to everything. The positive side is they have this confidence and belief in themselves. And the negative side is that sometimes Americans come off as proud and arrogant and self-centered because they do believe that they are special. Okay, moving over to proceed to all of the things that we talked about. Like I said, some of these are more like, I said you have to know the people, you should know the events, and you should know the ideas. Those are kind of the three things that interact in this class to give you an understanding of what American culture is like and British culture as they developed. So the British Empire, you need to know about Nelson, you need to know about Queen Victoria. Those are the major people I think that I don't think we talked in detail about anybody else. Charles Dickens, Jane Austen. I think that's all we need, the people that you really need to know about. Imperialism is the main concept here. And of course, the British Empire creates Colonial America. So these are very closely related to each other. We talked about Columbus. He's an important person. All the people, most of the American people that we talked about are from Revolutionary America, especially Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington. I emphasize those three people. Colonial America, yeah, we talked about slavery and Native America. Those are ideas, those are systems and situations and cultures that span from before the United States exists until now, right? The effects. There's no slavery, of course, anymore, but the effects of slavery have continued, right? So, you have to know about some of the major tribes of the Native Americans, and this sort of goes, like I said, this goes from 1592 all the way until the present, right? And slavery starts in America. The first slaves arrive, and I can't remember exactly if it's 1620, but around 1620, and they arrive, and then eventually they are freed, but they're discriminated against until the Civil Rights Movement in 1965 makes some improvements, but still the inheritance of slavery is still something that African Americans have to deal with to this day, in the forms of systemic racism, and that's one of the core issues about education. That the reason I talked about it so much is because in America, there are some places where they try to, what's the best word? De-emphasize or reduce the focus on racism and discrimination. So there has been an increased focus on what we call critical race theory as something that you need to study in school, but there's states and educators, politicians who are resisting it and say that they shouldn't be teaching it. I'm firmly on the side of critical race theory is essential for all people, whatever their appearance or background, to study. You need to be critical of everything. That's part of this course, not just race. You need to be critical of class and gender and culture and perspective. So anything that starts with critical something is a subject I think it's worthwhile. All right. So going back to where I was. These obviously, like I said, these are all related to each other. If you separate it into chunks, it's easier to study. So imperialism, British Empire, important people that are related to Britain, Industrial Revolution, right? These are all things that you can kind of put under the British Empire umbrella. Colonial America, what was it like? What were the colonies like? How did revolutionary America, start to break away from the British influence? What were the ideas that were important? Remember, it's death and taxes again. Basically, they won the war against the French, so the French were not there. And the colonists wanted to expand, but the British Empire didn't want to let them. That was one thing. They started these the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, these and the tea, right? The Boston Tea Party, all of these events, and then the pamphlets started suggesting. I said Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, promoted the idea that of course America's too big and has too much potential. It shouldn't be controlled by a tiny little island off the corner of Europe. We should be in control of our own destiny. That's what he argued in his famous pamphlet. And the idea that you shouldn't be taxed without representation. No taxation without representation was the phrase, the watchword, the most important catchphrase going into the Revolutionary War. Okay, as you said, you got to know those three founding fathers. Civil War, obviously the main issue of the Civil War was the South trying to keep its rights. They say it's states' rights, but it really is the states' rights. The state's right to keep slavery. It's related to. It's an economic issue. It's a social issue. It's a cultural issue. It's whether the federal government has the right to control them or not. But the reason that they're fighting a war is because they don't want to give up the slave system. As I explained to you in some detail, it was a pretty horrible system. It originally wasn't race-based, but as Christians were not supposed to enslave Christians. First of all, Native people didn't make very good slaves. They weren't as numerous as they used to be, and the conditions of slavery hadn't really existed in Native American society. So they either ran away or couldn't physically handle the situation, or just mentally couldn't sustain the kind of abuse, the kind of hard labor and hopelessness that being a slave on a plantation entailed. But there was already slavery, as I explained. There was already slavery in Africa. There was already slavery in the Middle East. Slaves have been traded in Europe, since Roman times. It was only recently that the Pope decided that, Christians decided that you're not allowed to enslave other Christians anymore. That was a modern idea coming from the church, which is usually not the way things went. Usually the church held on to a lot of medieval and ancient ideas, but not in this case. So, I mean, if they could get somebody who looked different and didn't have a religion or culture or language that matched their own, then they could more easily distinguish and separate slaves from free people, owners and free people from slaves. And that's where the justification for racial discrimination in many ways started. They started to argue that, well, white people are superior genetically and culturally, and we're not more civilized, and so we have a right to control other people and own them as property. All these ideas were not originally there in the United States. They developed in the 18th century and into the 19th century. The states in the South stubbornly held onto them until there was a terrible war, the worst, the bloodiest war in American history, where they tried to kill each other. Ulysses S. Grant, Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, those are the main people I wanted you to know about from there. They're generals on either side. William Tecumseh Sherman is the guy who says in the textbook, its glory is all moonshine, which means, it's artificial, fake alcohol, meaning that war is not a glorious thing. When you might get really drunk from this alcohol, but you're going to understand your mistake and how horrible it is the next day when you wake up, and your head is going to explode from the hangover, because moonshine is illegally made alcohol that you do at home, and so it can kill you if it's done. That's why it's illegal. You're not allowed to make spirits at home, because you can actually make poison and kill people. So that's what war is like. You might seem like it's a great idea to become a hero and go fight in a war, but when you go there and you see everybody getting killed, and you suffer, and you're hungry, and it's dangerous, and you get injured, and see friends and family disappear, and you see the landscape on fire and destroyed, then you understand your mistake. And World War I, we talked about how terrible World War I was, and how everything from the beginning of the war to the end changed, how America benefited. That's one of the reasons that the American century is the 20th century. It's because the European powers had two catastrophic wars, which weakened them. Many people died, obviously, is the main thing, but economically, it was financially a huge burden, and infrastructure and buildings. The civilization almost destroyed itself. As you know, at the end of World War II, the atomic bomb was dropped on Japan. And at that point, you're getting weapons so powerful that you might actually end up destroying the world in the end. So the American century starts with America starting to join these empires, fighting the Spanish-American War, taking over the Philippines, and becoming less isolationist, and becoming more international, and participating in these wars, which George Washington said, don't. Remain neutral, but that's not the way America is. So the national character of the United States and its identity shifts, and gradually it transforms itself so that America never had a standing army, for example. Even the Civil War, they raised these armies, they fought after the war, the soldiers maintained peace in the South, but ultimately their army, everybody was sent home. They would raise an army, fight wars, and then they would disband. After World War II is when the United States starts to have this big military that they keep sustained military with a huge, enormous budget. It's very, very expensive to have a standing army of 1 million people and with all this technology and equipment. But the military becomes increasingly integrated with the economy. And that's something I forgot to mention during the class, so I'm not going to ask you a question about that. But there's a military-industrial complex which Eisenhower warns about. I hope it's in the textbook, but there are the presidents that you need to know. Like the most important thing about the president is enough. I'm not going to ask you a random thing about John F. Kennedy or Richard Nixon. You just basically need to know Richard Nixon got in a big scandal called Watergate, and John F. Kennedy was a really popular Democrat, and he was young, and he was assassinated. Okay, Eisenhower was a general in World War II, and he was the leader of NATO and the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe, and he retired from his military role, and he became the president of the United States after Truman, after Harry Truman. So the American century, we broke it down into different periods. Make sure you know those periods and the crises that separate them, the Great Depression and the Civil Rights Movement, and make sure you know about Hollywood. That's how I ended the class, except for there was a few cultural components. Right? The cultural components I also talked about the last class, entertainment, military, economy, technology, and the political system. Don't forget that, because that's not in the textbook. The range of chapters, of course, is from the very beginning of the book, from the introduction to the end of chapter 7. But as you know, I omitted a couple things. For example, I did omit Churchill and the British, contribution in World War I, in World War II. I left that out because we were running out of time. So I didn't really talk about Britain now, which is a shame because I usually do, and I wanted to talk about Brexit, and I wanted to talk about Margaret Thatcher and Winston Churchill and other aspects of British culture. For example, the sort of nostalgia that they have for the British Empire, that it's gone, and the Great Britain, the United Kingdom is an important country, but it's not nearly as important as it used to be. The sort of, peak, the heyday of the British has passed, the golden age, and they know that. And America, has the sensitivity to that too. Is America going to be diminished or less important in the future? That's one of the reasons Donald Trump was successful in his campaign when he said, his slogan was "Make America Great Again." That he was playing to those people who thought that the great age of America was over and that he was going to bring it back. Obviously, he didn't. He was an incompetent president, but he was playing to an emotion. He was appealing to American people and American culture and the values they have, which is they do still think they're special. So that's the best I can do in 40 minutes. There's a lot of material, obviously. Like I said, you just need to know the main things from before the midterm. Don't dig too deeply, and make sure the things that I emphasized today, at least But there's a few things that I didn't mention. So, but if you know all of these core elements of the course, I think you will do fine on Friday. So June 10th is our appointment in room 124. I will see you on Friday at 12 o'clock. If there's any questions, make sure you ask them as soon as possible, because it's going to be a busy week for me as we go towards the exam. And if you want me to answer you, then you should ask me soon. Okay? Thank you for listening, and thank you for attending the course. Good luck on Friday. See you then.